Okay, welcome everyone. We'll go and get started here. Welcome to Democracy as Climate Resilience, which is the third webinar in our Faithful Resilience, Faithful Preparedness series. We're pleased to be hosting the series in collaboration with SBP. My name is Avery Davis Lamb, and I'm a co-executive director at Creation Justice Ministries. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, and mobilize Christians and Christian institutions in the work of protecting, restoring, and rightly sharing God's creation. And today's program and this full annual or year-long webinar series is part of our Climate Resilience Workshop series, where we're asking this question: how can our churches be hubs of climate resilience in our communities, helping our neighbors weather the physical, social, and spiritual storms of the climate crisis? Over the course of this series, we've been working with our partners at SBP to share faith-rooted, practical ways to prepare for climate disasters in your community and to build resilience. Today, we're looking at the connections between a functioning, healthy democracy, climate resilience, and the key role that faith communities can play in both. Today is about seeing more clearly why deep democracy is crucial for climate justice and resilience, and to start developing some of the tools to be agents of democracy and resilience. We hope that you'll leave this webinar today with perspectives and tools to play your part in strengthening democracy for a climate resilient world. We have two guests with us today, Dr. Kathleen Bonnette and Chris Crawford, who I'll introduce later in the program. But let me first share our roadmap for today. After our opening prayer and introductory remarks, I'll get us started by sharing some background information about the connection between deep democracy and faithful resilience. Dr. Bonnette will lead us in a presentation on the theological dimensions of climate resilience and their connections with democracy, and Chris will offer some practical resources for our faith communities to engage in democracy protection. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so all along the way, please think about your questions, and then all in all, we'll get you out of here around 15 past the hour, which would be 7:15 Eastern Time, and you can calculate what that means for your own time. Just a few housekeeping things to note. If you haven't yet, please introduce yourself in the chat. Like I said, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentations. I ask that you please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. Don't use the chat function to submit questions because it'll be hard for me to keep track of the questions in there. So make sure those end up in the Q&A function so I see them. Although you're welcome to engage with the chat and respond in whatever way you would like. And then finally, as you can see, this workshop is being recorded, and we'll send out the recording and make it available to everyone who registered via email next week. Now I'm going to invite Dr. Kathleen Bonnette to open us in prayer, and then right after that, Leanne Ortiz will share about the work of SBP. Kathleen, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I chose a prayer that was written by Pope Francis. I am Catholic, so it's fitting. So this is a prayer for our earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Leanne Ortiz. I have the pleasure of serving as SBP's Community Preparedness Engagement Manager. I don't know about you all, but I'm very excited about today's webinar. Now, a little bit more about SBP for those of you who are joining us and might be wondering what SBP is. SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit whose mission is to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. SBP started right after Hurricane Katrina in San Bernard Parish, New Orleans, with the goal of helping people who were reaching their breaking point and to return them to safe, sanitary, and secure housing conditions. Since then, we have been able to serve dozens of communities nationwide. While SBP's primary focus was long-term recovery, throughout the years, we have expanded to cover the entire disaster cycle through our 5 interventions: rebuild, prepare, share, advise, and advocate. This has allowed us to help communities prepare, respond immediately to disasters in vulnerable communities, continue the arduous work of long-term recovery, and so much more. We will be sharing a link to our website and invite you to look at what SBP has been up to and also access our household preparedness guide. Lastly, we want to thank Creation Justin Ministries for your partnership, and we hope that you enjoy today's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Leanne. It's such a gift to be co-hosting the series with you. Thanks to you and everyone at SBP for the good work and for collaborating with us at Creation Justice Ministries. We're going to transition now into our program. And the first thing is that I'm going to get us started with a background on faithful resilience and deep democracy to frame the presentations from Kathleen and from Chris. So first, I want to start by sharing my screen and sharing a little bit about what I mean when I say resilience. Resilience is a word that's used a lot right now, and climate resilience is also a term that is used a lot. So resilience, I often use this definition of resilience that comes from the Kresge Foundation Pathways to Resilience report from 2015, which defines resilience as climate change mitigation plus adaptation plus deep democracy. And together that creates resilience. We may know what climate change mitigation is, right? It's the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. Adaptation is the need to build systems and structures, both social and physical, to live in a climate changed world. And deep democracy is what we're talking about today. The need to develop and sustain institutions of democracy and civic participation that ensure that those who are most directly impacted by climate change are those who are making the decisions and who are integrally involved in the work of policy decisions and structures that create the community that we want to live in, create the future, a cooler future for our world. The Kresge Foundation report, the Pathways to Resilience report, is very clear, and I think this is really helpful to say that resilience is about bouncing forward to eradicate the inequities and the unsustainable resource use at the heart of the climate crisis. Often the framing of resilience is about bouncing back, right? Recovering quickly, bouncing back to the way things were. But we don't want to just bounce back to the way things were. We want to make sure that we're bouncing forward to a new, more sustainable, more just world, and that we're using this moment, this climate change moment that we find ourselves in, to address and eradicate the inequities that have created the situations where we are, that have perpetuated unsustainable resource use, and that have found frontline communities to be in the center of climate injustice. So that requires the work of democracy, the engagement in the work of democracy. So this is all what goes into people-centered resilience. There's economy, right? The need to move beyond fossil fuels and develop a zero carbon economy, the need to build local economic infrastructure and situate, right? The site of resilience is necessarily local, because the impacts of climate change are necessarily local. And so there needs to be economic infrastructure that is built up locally to ensure that the local communities are resilient and adaptive. And then finally, we need to redefine what it means to live a good life, right? We can't just keep growing and growing and growing. The obsession with consumption both in our own lives and particularly in our economy, has for too long defined the good life. And I think particularly as people of faith, as Christians, we have a different definition of the good life, one that looks to limits, one that looks to circular economy as what it means to be good and to be whole and to be sustainable. The second, of course, is ecology, reimagining our collective identity and our relationship with the natural world. Again, as Christians, as people of faith, we believe that the world is God's creation. And we believe that that means that humans are necessarily related to the rest of the natural world, that we are not separate, we are not extricable, but that we are actually tied in a web of belonging with all of the rest of the natural world. And then also recognize the need for the rights of nature in balance with human rights. At Creation Justice Ministries, our tagline is justice for God's planet and God's people, because we recognize that without justice for God's planet, we really cannot have justice for God's people. And of course, the vice versa is also true. And then finally, where we find ourselves, human rights and democracy, the need to advance equity and social justice, to reflect human rights principles, and to address historical injustices. So this is the work that we're here today to do. It's also work that is particularly important this year in a time where democracy is under threat, when the institution of democracy in our country is so severely under threat, and when too often voices of faith are weaponized and utilized in the fight against democracy instead of in the fight to ensure everyone has access to human rights, and that those who are most affected by climate change are the ones who are most engaged in the decision-making around climate. So that's the work that we are up to today. That's the work that I'm calling you all to for now through November. And of course, it doesn't end in November either. But I'm grateful to Kathleen, who's going to frame this some more theologically for us and think about the connections between the theological call to climate resilience and love of creation and democracy, and to remake those connections, remember those connections, and then over to Chris, who's going to offer some really practical resources for the ways that our faith communities can be engaged in the work of protecting democracy, because that work is necessary to build a climate resilient world. So with that, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Kathleen Bonnette. She's on staff with the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown University and an adjunct lecturer of theology. She holds a THD from LaSalle University, and her focus areas include moral theology, Catholic social thought, Augustinian spirituality, and ecofeminism. I want to highlight that she's the author of Revolutionary Hope, a spirituality of encounter and engagement in an evolving world, and I'll drop the link to that book in the chat in just a second. I had the joy of meeting both Kathleen and Chris at a Faith Table event that happened just a few months ago, and they're both very important voices right now in the work of democracy and in the work of bringing faith communities along. So Kathleen, I will hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Avery. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation and excited to have this with all of you and to share this time. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me see. All right. I hope you can all see that. If not, please let me know. But I'm here tonight. Avery asked me to come and offer a theological perspective on this theme of democracy as climate resilience. And it seems to me that ultimately the importance of democratic institutions and participation grows out of the same root as the importance of climate resilience and care for creation. So in other words, approaching this topic theologically can help uncover the necessity of democracy and climate resilience and highlight the links between the two. Just as a heads up, as I go through, the themes of participation, non-domination, and embodied action and community will be kind of central and woven throughout. this presentation. So let's start with a scripture. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through the Word, and without the Word, nothing came to be. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. As I was planning for this conversation, this passage immediately came to mind, and I imagine most of us are pretty familiar with these verses, but I do think that it holds much significance for our reflection and this conversation today. So, in the beginning was the Word. The Christian tradition has generally understood this as a sort of underlying reality of all that is. The idea of the word, the logos, came about in reference to cosmology or to the interconnectedness of the universe and all things. So the word is the relationship between all things. Theologian Kat Armas reminds us that the Greeks then later used that word to describe the relationship between all things as a sacred or divine process of dialogue, a cosmic conversation, she says. And then when it was translated to Latin, it was translated with a word that means discourse, a dynamic and lively dialogue, from a root that implies a weaving together. So again, and this is referencing Armas again, the concept of the word here should put us in mind of a joining together of ideas, thoughts, and processes. It is an intimate and dynamic conversation. And let's recall the first words attributed to the word in Genesis. Let there be. An invitation to all that is into this dynamic cosmic conversation. That is the foundation, the reality of our existence. And a quick philosophical side note, it might help to deepen our understanding of this reality to point out that we know that God is love, that the Word who is God is love. And when I think about this love, this fundamental dynamism inviting us all into existence and weaving all things together, I'm reminded of the long tradition in Christian theology of defining love as willing the good of another. But I also think the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who was reflecting on authoritarianism during World War II, relied on a definition of love by St. Augustine, which is, I will that you be. And so I think this helps to clarify or deepen what it means to will the good of another. So willing the good of the other is not to will that they fall into a particular pattern or to coerce them into particular ways of being. Rather, it is that we will that they exist and that they are whole. And we see this in Genesis too, right? God, love itself, saying, let there be. Not authoritatively, as we often read it, but invitationally. So this love of God that invites all that is to be, to bring its whole self into the community of being, offers an important understanding and lens through which to view democratic engagement. To love our neighbors is to invite all to participate in this dynamic conversation. So then we get to the Word made flesh. Now we know that our neighbors do not just include other humans. Being made in the image of this Trinity, this God who is relationship, being part of this cosmic conversation and part of this dynamism that is embodied flesh, that invites us to understand ourselves as inextricably belonging to one another. If we believe that we are made in the image of a relational God, we're relational all the way down. So our well-being always must be correlated to the well-being of our neighbors in the community of life, human and more than human. Jesus, like us, was dust of the earth. And in Christ, the Word made flesh, all things hold together. So we are part of nature, evolved from the same elements, dependent on the same energy. We're not separate from, but integral to the ecosystems that make up the web of life, which is held together in the body of Christ. So the relational unity of God grounds our reality as creation evolves from and toward this relational unity through ever expansive and increasingly complex relationships. And contemporary scientific insights tell us that, in fact, we are quite literally interconnected with one another and our planet. So my being is tied to yours, as well as that of the stars and the sea. Each of us is part of this creation story, this conversation. So this is important because if all things hold together in Christ, and sin is what separates us from God, then sin is also what separates us from one another. It creates fissures between us and our world. It distorts the reality of our existence by blinding us to our interrelatedness and muting our participation in the cosmic conversation. We see in Genesis, for example, in this story of the fall, right, that Adam and Eve live in harmony with the more than human world until the fall, until that decision to exceed their limits and empower themselves by exploiting the earth and taking what is not theirs. Avery referenced or mentioned how consumption is such a huge problem and one that people of faith should be working against. And I think, you know, even our fall story has overconsumption at its heart. So it's really important to think along those lines of what was it that the fall actually did. It separated humanity from the earth and from one another by this exploitative action. And then we see throughout history this exploitative view of the natural world, right, which goes hand in hand with the exploitation of other human beings as well. I think the story of Cain and Abel offers a great example of this. So too, you know, we see it in the subjugation of women as a scapegoat measure for human sin, as we've interpreted it through our tradition. And so at a certain point, the cosmology of interconnection got subsumed by an understanding of the universe as an ordered static hierarchy that placed soul over body, male over female, human over non-human, and so on. So by assigning different levels of being or different levels of participation to different groups, this worldview really distorted the dynamism of our reality. By assigning matter, the flesh, right, a less dignified place, it became really easy to oppress and marginalize those who were aligned more closely with matter. So animals, the earth, women, etc. So this hierarchical paradigm has motivated the human pursuit of domination throughout history. It's bred all kinds of isms, racism, sexism, anthropocentrism, in the name of pursuing the good, right? So those at sort of the top of the hierarchy can claim to be promoting the good of those underneath them, even as they are being subjugated. And throughout history, humans have othered those who could be exploited, tearing the fabric of the web of life for the sake of personal gain, or simply because we love power. Avery mentioned I'm an Augustinian scholar, and so St. Augustine called the human tendency to pursue power the libido dominandi, which means the lust for domination. And I think that's a really helpful lens to look at human sin, right? This lust for domination, which we think will promote our gain, but actually ends up tearing us apart, fostering this separation of ourselves from the rest of the community of being. And this is, of course, a distortion of reality, right? Reality is not ordered hierarchically, but is interwoven. We are relational all the way down. Our good depends on the good of all and upon the ability of each to participate fully in the cosmic conversation, that invitation to be again. And so this is where we get to democracy. Right. So the challenge of democracy is that it too can play into this distorted reality if we aren't careful. Right. Insofar as this plays out of the human heart, we've got to address that before we can say that any one system will be great. However, it's interesting to note that Alexis de Tocqueville in the early 1800s, when he was reflecting on this American experiment of democracy, he wrote that the danger is that it delinks people, right? Or it separates people. So whereas in a hierarchical system, everyone knows their place, and functions accordingly. A democracy breaks those boundaries and gives the impression, or can give the impression, that we're all isolated individuals looking out for ourselves. So self-interest can become the defining feature rather than communal ties, which then the worry would be that self-interest becomes detached from the common good, right? Of course, as we've seen, this worry about delinking happened long before American democracy came on the scene. But still, it's an important concern. If we lose our connection to each other, our political engagement will always be rooted in selfish concern. But if we understand that we belong to one another, that we are interconnected and relational beings whose love for each other comes about through willing the good, through ensuring the participation of all and the conditions necessary for flourishing, so things like food, shelter, water, healthy ecosystems, things that everybody needs, then we can engage in politics in ways that maintain the stability and the health of our communities, the more than human world included. And this is precisely where faith traditions have a critical role to play. So religion actually comes from the Latin word that means relinking, to relink or rebind. And I think that's a really important piece of this as we're thinking through what it is that separates us, how it is that we got to the point where we are so fractured. What could possibly help us come back together? And so given that religion comes from actually a word that means relinking, I think that's a wonderful place to start. And Ivone Gabarra recognizes that religions have an undeniable social role in helping us to develop the sensibilities we need in order to love the earth and the human community in light of the indissoluble communion among all beings. I love that quote, and I think it's so true. I think religions have such an important role to play in fostering the mentality, the worldview that can help us find our way home. And in the Christian tradition, we understand ourselves to be rooted in a foundational reality of love made flesh, right? A foundational reality that invites each one to participate fully in the community of being. So we can recognize that we are called to foster that reality, to foster a paradigm that orients us toward the interconnectedness of ourselves and every other being, and moves us to work for the flourishing of all. So mediating institutions like churches and other community networks serve a critical role in helping to relink, in restoring these broken links through offering ways to engage in embodied action for the common good with our neighbors. To me, this relinking through embodied care, deep listening, and community building sounds like the basis for climate resilience. And as Indigenous theologian Randy Woodley writes, by realizing the connectedness of humankind to all animal life and life in every form, we become aware of new possibilities. And I think that's another really crucial piece of this, that a paradigm of connectedness, of this understanding that we are all involved in this dynamic cosmic conversation, opens up ways of thinking through challenges that we maybe would never have known or were blind to before. So today, we know that political instability is very much correlated to environmental instability, right? Drought leads to struggle over food and water sources. Extreme heat increases violent behavior. We see all these connections just right in front of us. On the other hand, stability prevails when those who are most directly affected by a given challenge have a voice in the development of the solutions and have the tools needed to address the challenges. Indigenous botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer speaks of what she calls the democracy of species. I highly recommend her book if you haven't read it. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. But she speaks of the democracy of species, And she wonders what it would look like to even give the more than human world a voice in our policymaking. So through attending to scientific research and also through personal engagement and observation, listening to the voices of the earth, right? The more than human world, to give them a say in what would foster a healthy ecosystem. So as we're thinking ourselves about policy, right, attending to those voices that often are marginalized or excluded, and also asking what will lead to the flourishing of all life, what will let everyone be. And thinking about how to do that will involve relinking to the earth and to one another, responding to changes in climate and extreme weather events in ways that empower local communities and restore the land. In this way, any Christian movement that sows discord or denies participation to others, any movement that focuses more on imposing Christian norms than on fostering the health and well-being and participation of all in the community of life, any Christian movement that doesn't seek out the voices of the marginalized will not be participating in the creative act or the love of God. Because God is loving relationship, domination never reflects the divine. And so, if democracy is to work, people of faith must reject the hierarchical framework of being, so humans at the top controlling the non-human world, etc. And we must begin to attend to the ways in which all life is interconnected, the ways in which we belong to each other and the more than human world. It will take a concerted effort to adjust our paradigm from that perpetuated by the fall, which tells us that we can take what isn't ours to take and act coercively rather than invitationally, which tells us that what matters is our own individual understanding of the good, our own power. Taking seriously our evolutive and practical interconnectedness, imbued with and held together in the incarnate Christ, necessitates a new paradigm. We must begin to act toward one another in ways that take this seriously. And we are challenged to transform ourselves and the systems we inhabit, to turn from self-serving and exploitative competition to collaborative mutual flourishing. A Christian approach to climate resilience must grow out of this paradigm of interconnectedness that is attentive to the ways in which all things work together, as well as the challenges and forces and habits that lead us to seek domination and isolation instead. Ensuring deep democracy is critical to this, as not only does democracy invite participation, but those who are most at risk for climate-related disasters are those who are also most likely to be disempowered or unheard in the political system. The two must go hand in hand if we are to live up to the call of our faith. And I will stop there and throw it back to you, Avery. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you so much. Thank you for that invitation, the invitation to invitation, and the reminder of the work that we're up to today, right? That both religion and politics, when it's at its best, is the work of relinking with each other. So thank you so much for that framing. That was perfect and exactly what we need to hear, exactly what I need to hear right now. We're going to pass it over now to Chris Crawford. Chris is a policy strategist at Protect Democracy, and his work there focuses on ensuring free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power, including staffing the National Task Force on Election Crises and managing the Faith in Elections Playbook, which is in partnership with Interfaith America. Chris also worked on Protect Democracy's team that successfully advocated for reforms to the Electoral Count Act. Before he was at Protect Democracy, he worked as a senior program associate at Democracy Fund, where he managed a portfolio of faith-based initiatives focused on promoting pluralism in the United States. Chris, it's a gift to have you here with us, and I'll pass it over to you.
It is a gift to be with you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I think you can see that. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you all. I'm Chris Crawford. I'm a policy strategist at Protect Democracy. Who is Protect Democracy? We are a nonpartisan organization with a particular focus to ensure that the United States does not slide into a more authoritarian form of government. And there are a number of ways we do this: through litigation, through combating mis and disinformation. We have a report, the Authoritarian Playbook for 2025, that really outlines some of the danger of authoritarianism at this moment. But a big piece of our work, as we focus on protecting democracy, is preserving free and fair elections. And that's where a lot of my work tends to sit. I want to note, in the description that I just gave you, we are not a climate-focused organization. We are not a religious organization, but we partner with organizations like yours because, frankly, nothing in our democracy does what faith does the way that faith does it. People of faith play a crucial role in preserving our democracy. And so I basically will show up anywhere anybody asks me to talk to people of faith about the way that they can help protect our democracy. What I like about our structure tonight is that I'm going to quickly go through some of the things that are, much of it is short term, much of it is focused on this election cycle, and it's focused on preserving our election system. Whereas Dr. Bonnette was really able to give you this deep way of thinking about engaging in politics more generally. So what do free and fair elections have to do with climate change? I'll start by just directly from the Protect Democracy website here. Elections are the linchpin of our democracy. Holding elections and ensuring that power changes hands in accordance with their outcomes is the essence of democratic self-government. By defending that, we protect our rights and our systems of government. I think of this, especially as a Christian, that it's important to understand that every single freedom that we enjoy, including our religious freedom, rests on a foundation of democratic institutions, including free and fair elections. And every issue that we care about advocating for, we can only make progress on that if we have free and fair elections, if we have pluralism, if we have the democratic norms and institutions that allow us to make that progress. In short, election results matter. This isn't a political or partisan statement, it's just a fact. Think about just the past 4 years when it comes to climate change. The sitting president ran for election in part on an agenda of doing something about climate change. Voters elected him, and there was an attempt to overturn the results of that election and the will of the people. If people distrust our elections to the point that they would allow the overturning of the results, then the will and intent of the people will not be realized. In the case of the 2020 election, our system barely did hold together, and the president followed through at least on some of the promises that he made related to the climate. Here's the challenging part, is we need to respect the results no matter who wins and work to preserve our election system and the rule of law. No matter a candidate's view on climate change, long-term progress depends on the system holding. If we don't ensure trust in our elections and stand up for the rule of law, then we can never depend on a system allowing us to advocate for change in the long term. And ultimately, it's up to each political coalition to focus on persuading our fellow Americans to agree with us enough to make change through the system. All of the other work that we do to make real change can be taken away if our system fails. What does this look like in 2024? Here's what I've been telling everyone that I speak to when I'm talking with faith audiences. One of the greatest contributions that people of faith make in our American society and globally is that when there is a crisis, when there's a hurricane, when there's a tornado or an earthquake, there are organizations like many of you on the call who are the first ones there. As soon as something happens, people of faith and faith institutions are running toward that challenge, showing up for people, providing food, providing water, providing shelter. We are in the democracy and elections equivalent of a tornado. We're seeing record distrust in our elections, record distrust in our institutions' ability to respond to the challenges that we face, and an increasing number of people saying that they think authoritarian leaders are necessary, that they would be open to political violence as a means to save the country. This is an all hands on deck moment for our democracy. And in 2024, I would submit that people of faith must mobilize not only around the issues and the candidates that we care about, but how to protect our elections themselves. At Protect Democracy, we are partnering with Interfaith America on a resource called the Faith in Elections Playbook. This is really what I love about this project is it's a website that's a one-stop shop where if you're interested in finding a nonpartisan way that you can help our elections run smoothly, you can go to this website. And it's also not something that is a collection of ideas that I came up with or that our great partners at Interfaith America came up with. We're lifting up the work that's already happening with faith-based communities around the country and making it easier for folks to find ways that they can take action in line with their values, with their skill sets, and the needs of their communities. So I'll just quickly go through some of the focus areas of this website. The first one I want to talk to you about is addressing polarization. We have links to a bunch of different organizations focused on different ways of addressing toxic polarization. We all know what a divisive election we are going to have this year. I think some of us a little bit are dreading what the tone of tonight's debate might be, for example. A lot of people, especially pastors, are probably wondering and worrying about what does tomorrow look like in my community after this debate? How can we help hold our communities together? And then posting accurate information on where and how to vote. We've got a wealth of resources on just accurate information because this is crucial, especially when we know there are attempts to give the wrong information, as we've seen especially targeting communities of color, trying to tell people to vote on a different day or don't vote with a certain method. Faith institutions are often very well trusted in local communities, and they can share accurate information. This is also just really important for this work in and of itself, but that also can be the foundation of get out the vote efforts as well. And then we have a few options around just having a presence at polling locations. One of my very favorite entities in our election system is Pizza to the Polls. They literally will deliver pizzas if there's a really long line at a polling location to help people who might be hungry to stay in line and cast their ballot. But there's also ways that different volunteer organizations can provide food and water at polling locations. We've got a guide that's based on Pizza to the Polls guide that outlines the different rules for how to do that. And we also are partnering with, especially Faiths United to Save Democracy as one organization, recruiting religious leaders to provide a peaceful presence at polling locations, to serve as poll chaplains, also going through things like de-escalation training to help keep the peace and ensure a positive environment at the polls. Another one of my favorites is recruiting poll workers. That's why I have this fun slide with the cats on it. Our elections depend on a network of 1 million poll workers signing up, who work at signing people in, managing the process on election day. These are everyday people. They're trained, they're paid, and it's a concrete way for people to give up some of their time to serve their community. And I should mention on that Power the Polls is an organization that makes it really easy to sign up to serve as a poll worker. You sign up, they get the information to your election officials, and the election officials get in touch with you on how to be trained. We have a specific link that I can try to send around that's just powerthepolls.org/faithinelections, where you can sign up. And then building relationships with election officials is another way, especially the role that faith leaders often play, whether it's individual houses of worship, nonprofit leaders, interfaith entities in a locality. They're trusted messengers, and building a relationship with election officials is a way to be able to take accurate information and provide it to your community, and also to bring the questions of your communities to the election officials. And a lot of election officials really have sort of an open door policy as far as inviting people in to see how the process works. They're testing machines and things like that so that people can really see how the process works. Another one that I think is interesting, and I learned a lot just researching this, is that we need to make sure there are enough polling locations to ensure short lines, to ensure that people don't have to travel as far to vote. And I learned in researching this that about 20% of polling locations nationwide are houses of worship, and it's over 50% in Arkansas and in Oklahoma, I think was the other one. And this is a role that people have to be careful about. Make sure you're doing this in a way that respects the First Amendment, that takes into account your own house of worship schedule. For example, one election official told me that the biggest barrier to faith-based organizations and especially churches serving as polling locations on election day is that a lot of them have bingo night on Monday nights and they forget about that. And there's all of a sudden a conflict that there's a dual purpose for the space. But this is a real way that folks can help make a difference in their elections. Now, why does this stuff matter? This is sort of the really unsexy parts of our democracy. But each of us has a role to play in ensuring that our democracy can long endure. And protecting democracy does take sort of bold action at pivotal moments, but it also demands these consistent, dutiful, ongoing activities by everyday people. And I would submit that in this election, at this moment that we are in, the dutiful activities are in their own way the heroic ones. So as we all discern how we want to vote, how we want to advocate for issues that we care about, we should also consider what's one more thing each of us can do to help make sure we have a free and fair election and a peaceful transfer of power. A few years ago, it was actually, I guess, 7 years ago now, I can't believe it. I had the opportunity to go on a congressional trip led by Representative John Lewis to Alabama to visit some of the civil rights sites. And that was really transformative to me. So I wanted to just close with a quote from John Lewis that I think captures a lot of what I'm trying to say better than I can say it, which is, my friends, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It's the most powerful nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union. And again, I'll just say all of the progress we want to make on any political issue depends on free and fair elections. And I want to commit to all of you to help you find your one more thing that you can do in order to help ensure that we have a smoothly run election in 2024 and a democracy that can endure and serve us for the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for sharing the good work that you're up to, that Protect Democracy is up to, and for inviting us into this work, this faithful work that is kind of lunch pail work, right? It's about showing up day in and day out and doing the unsexy work that we need to do, but that is the work of ensuring that all of the people we love have access to democracy, and work that I think many of us as folks involved in faith institution and in churches are familiar with. So thank you for the invitation and to those resources. Kathleen, I'm going to invite you to come on the screen here, and we are going to transition into a time of Q&A. I have a couple questions queued up to share, but I want to invite everyone who's here, please think about any questions you have for Chris and for Kathleen. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and I'm sure there are lots of things that are on your mind that you want to hear them talk about. So again, put those questions into the Q&A function, and I'll be sure to check in on that and share those with Chris and with Kathleen. Kathleen, I want to start with a question for you. Recently I've been thinking about resilience as the work of hospitality, and hearing you talk about God's invitational work, the invitational work of Christ, who holds all things together and through whom all things are redeemed. It seems like this relinking is also the work of hospitality. It's invitational. It's creating the spaces for things to flourish rather than coercing them in any kind of way. So I guess that's my question, is like, take hospitality and play around a little bit with me.
Yeah, I love that. I think absolutely hospitality is a really important way of thinking about this. Not only, I think it can help us sort of check where we are and what it is that we can actually do to invite others in, right, or to foster participation. My worry would be that only focusing on hospitality might have sort of a possessive Like it could make us think that we are inviting people to something that we don't actually have the right or the right way of inviting. But I think that framing of, insofar as we are in places, we want to invite others to belong, right? And I think that's a really important takeaway here. So thank you for raising that. I'll have to think about that a little bit more.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, totally. Well, and you know, part of it really is like the language of hospitality is so familiar to our faith traditions, much more than the language of resilience. And it's much less politicized than the language of politics, right? We're so scared of politics. We're so scared of the word climate as well. But you know, I've never been to a church or a faith community that doesn't want to be a hospitable community. So like I'm just wondering, like even practically, like how can we frame, you know, being a polling location as the work of hospitality, um, as a faith leader, being a poll worker or a poll chaplain as the work of hospitality, and you know, especially for communities that some of this is more tense and tenuous, maybe some purple congregations. Then framing it using the values that exist in your community, maybe it's hospitality, maybe it's something else, might come off really well. Chris, a question for you. You know, I'm wondering if you have a story or an example that you could share of congregations or faith leaders who have found caring and effective ways of overcoming division in their communities. I think sometimes it's hard to find a place to start, and it can be really scary when things are so tense. You know, there's so many third rails, third, fourth, fifth rails. There's a lot of electrified rails out here to not touch that, you know, often the response is to just stay entirely away from politics. But I know that there are lots of faithful, prophetic, wise leaders out there who have found a way. And I'm wondering if you have any stories to share with us around that.
Absolutely. There are so many coming to mind. This is a real blessing, especially when you think about religion and democracy and the stories that we hear. You would think it might be difficult to pull stories of what's a positive contribution, which is part of the reason why this work is important, is I think we want to highlight these types of stories. A few that I'll mention, there are some stories of poll chaplains in 2020 and in 2022 really being in situations where someone was trying to be disruptive at a polling location. And as far as I've heard, nothing rising to the level of real concern about violence or anything, but just disruptions and people trying to create a scene and a negative environment at a polling location where religious leaders were able to go. There's one story from Michigan in particular, go up to the person in the truck and just start talking to them and engaging them with kindness, with the spirit of hospitality that you're talking about. And that just de-escalated the situation pretty quickly. There were also, I've heard from Jewish leaders in Pennsylvania, especially, who, amidst some of the chaos during the post-election period in 2020, there was a strategic decision by organizers to not try to respond to escalation with escalation, respond to fear and anger with fear and anger. People literally having like dance parties outside of election centers and trying to have a positive experience. And that got some good coverage. There's also someone who's a grantee of the Interfaith America project, the Faith and Elections Playbook, who's a pastor in Arizona, and he ministers to, and he's coming out with a book on Christian nationalism. His name's Reverend Caleb Campbell, and he's ministering to people who have really sort of embraced Christian nationalism, who might be susceptible to more extreme views, but he's ministering in a way that's very loving, and it's very centered on reaching them. It's not as sharp as some of the more political manifestations that we've seen in those conversations. And then just lots of stories from poll workers around the country. Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons from the Baptist Joint Committee has a blurb on our website about his experience serving as a poll worker, and people really bringing their faith to that experience, not in a way that's imposing their Christianity, but in a way that is, the people that I am serving at this election place reflect the image of God, and I want to make sure that they have a positive experience. I want to treat them with dignity. So these stories really reflect the framing of your first question. And I'm hoping that we can continue to just have these wonderful stories and work with Interfaith America to get these stories out there throughout the election.
Yeah, I love the image of the dance party. And it makes me think about like the role that embodiment plays in all of this. You know, back to Kathleen, you mentioning embodiment. Um, and so I guess related to that, Kathleen, I have a question about, you know, one of the responses to this is to talk about it, right? To preach about it from the pulpit, to talk about it, all of which is really good. But I'm also wondering if you could share like what practices of embodiment, what can we engage in our faith communities that sort of gets us out of our heads, and you know, reminds us that we are connected with each other and with creation. I don't know if you've seen anything that's worked really well around that, or if you just have ideas of what might work well.
I mean, I think Chris's idea of a dance party is
Yeah.
perfect.
Mhm.
No, I think, I mean, well, I'll just start on a personal level. For me, this all was in my head until I started gardening. And then, and then I went,
Mhm.
oh, this is this is what it's about, right? This is we're living reciprocally with these plants and the soil and the worms, and you know, we're all engaged in this beautiful work of creation. Um, and so for me, you know, I highly recommend gardening or getting a pot with a flower in it, just something to get your hands in the dirt. But I think that goes back to the embodiment is it can be in the head until it's practiced. Or maybe people, you know, for people who are skeptical, right? Once they start practicing this, it becomes real and then it makes more sense. And so I think any kinds of practices that can build the community by engaging in this kind of embodied care, whether it's a community garden or whether it's not even, you know, or maybe it's only tangentially related to something specifically earthy, but something that is a practice of communal embodied care, I think goes a long way, not only to putting this into the world, but also putting it into our hearts, right, through that embodied experience. Um, this is just a side note, but I was just reading a book called Native American Theology. Theology of, yeah. And it's a really beautiful book. And there was a passage in it that was talking about how in a lot of indigenous cultures, or in Western tradition, we think of knowledge as coming from the head, right? That's where it's associated. But in a lot of indigenous cultures, because knowledge comes from the ground, that's sort of reversed, that knowledge is a very much a felt and experienced and embodied reality as opposed to something in the mind. And I think that's really helpful, maybe. I thought it was interesting anyway.
Yes, yes. Well, and I see resonance there with the Genesis 2 creation story, and like humankind was not created out of God's mind, but out of God working with the soil and breathing life, the
Yeah.
spirit of life. Yeah. Thanks, Kathleen. We're going to transition now to questions from you all who are here with us. I'm trying to capture the ones that are coming in the chat, but just a reminder that if you have a question that you really want to get answered, please put it in the Q&A function so I can make sure to find it. We'll start with this first one. Chris, maybe with you and then Kathleen. What are the most effective ways to encourage people to vote?
That's a great question. And I think it's really important because a lot of people are exhausted of our politics. A lot of people are not satisfied with our options when we go to vote. A couple of things is I think, for one, helping people understand it makes a difference. And you should choose who you vote for based on your values, but understand it does make a difference. I think one of the biggest lies about our politics is that it doesn't matter who you vote for. It does matter and it makes a difference. And I think it can also be very privileged in a lot of cases to choose to step out of voting because you're not happy with the options. There are people that you might not feel the difference of not voting, but there are people who will feel that difference. I also think about some of the stories of the history of fighting for the right to vote. And I have Fannie Lou Hamer over my shoulder here and thinking of her story as a woman who was assaulted by the police when she was trying to register people to vote. She was thrown out of where she was living on someone's land because she wanted to register people to vote, and what she faced to keep going and keep advocating for the right to vote. And the stories of folks like John Lewis, I sort of hold on to that when I start thinking I've had a difficult day or I want to disengage from our democracy. People who at the time were not even enjoying full citizenship were still pushing for the right to vote in ways that, facing hardships that I can't even imagine. And so I think there's a storytelling piece there too about the changes that voting can make in people's lives, as well as how precious the right to vote is.
Kathleen, what about you? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Chris that the storytelling is crucial. Just and a reminder, especially for people of faith, that it's not just about what voting will get you, right? That it is so much bigger than you. And so to use your vote in a way that promotes participation, right? That it promotes the dignity of all, and that, you know, even if we don't see that for a while, even if there are failures and it's demoralizing, that there's still something precious and important about participating in that way, right? That's a good in itself.
And I had just one more thing that I was just thinking of with that Michael Ware, who runs the Center for Christianity and Public Life. I'm a founding board member of that organization. Something he reminds people is that your vote is a way of loving your neighbor, but your vote doesn't take up your whole identity. And I think sometimes we can get so worked up about making the right choice to vote, or saying, I don't want to vote for this person because I have X, Y, Z disagreements with them on both sides of the aisle. I've worked on both sides of the aisle in politics and hear this on both sides, that people agonize over what does it mean for who I am if I pull the lever for one candidate for another. And I think there are implications for who we vote for. But understanding that the work that you're doing day in, day out to serve your neighbors and to be in relationship with God is what defines you. Your vote, you don't get to choose your candidates in the way that we might like to. Michael says that God is not surprised when you're in the voting booth. God knows what is going on in there and knows the choices that you have. So I think releasing us from some of this pressure that we put on our marrying our identity to our vote, I think can be really helpful while not minimizing the importance of our vote.
Yeah, thanks to you both. An interesting question came in here about the place of church polling places. The question is, do church polling places inhibit potential voters and in turn hurt democratic engagement? And is there any research about such a notion, the impact of churches as polling places on democratic engagement?
That's a great question. And I'll say that is the most contentious of the options within the Faith and Elections Playbook. So a few things on that sort of big picture to start out is this is a role that these entities can play. It's been affirmed by the Supreme Court. And there's a lot of work that goes into ensuring that these spaces are utilized in the right way. There are different guidelines that we have in the Faith and Elections Playbook, for example, about covering up things in the sanctuary, trying not to have a polling location like in the middle of a sanctuary. Like as a Catholic, I don't want someone voting right underneath the crucifix. As someone who believes in the Constitution, there's one thing, and as someone who's a Catholic, like it feels almost irreverent in some ways. But to answer the specific question, there are some studies that have shown a small amount of priming in people's vote being determined by the environment that they're voting in. And it's sort of on the margins. But I think the important thing, if you're considering getting involved in this way, is to try to do this in a way that the space is as neutral as it can possibly be. Make sure that there aren't political messages, and this is true for all polling locations anyway, not political messages on the wall or anything that would be priming people's vote in one direction or the other. There are ways to do this that we can provide enough spaces without worrying about infringing on the First Amendment. And the last thing I'll say just specifically about the Faith and Elections Playbook is we aren't only talking about houses of worship and like JCCs and like church gyms and halls and things like that. But there's also guides for just finding a civic space, like ensuring we have enough polling locations. You can use your own spaces at your house of worship, but you also might just say, here are different entities within town that are large enough to house a polling location. So we also don't want to box people in to do anything that they might not be comfortable with.
Great, great. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to end Q&A with this question, which is a question about hope, which I often receive when I'm talking about climate, and I suspect that you two often receive when you're talking about politics and democracy. And so the question is, how do we find hope when we've already lost ethical grounding in our Supreme Court and corporate informed manipulation of our elections? And then also a question from this person is, what can be the role of lay leaders? So if you have something to say about the role of lay leaders in this, in addition to, clergy, that would be great. And then would love to end with a comment from you both on how to find hope in the midst of what feels like hopelessness and all these things that are moving around us that are outside of, seemingly outside of our control. So Kathleen, why don't we start with you and then go to Chris?
Well, mine actually, thank you for this question. I think it's such an important one. Would it be okay if I shared my screen? Because I actually
Absolutely.
had a last slide that is a poem that that means a lot to me along these lines. And so I think it would just be fitting to close with that, if that's all right. Let me find it here. Oops. So it's called, sorry, there we go. It's called Daffodils. And this poem, again, reminds me that this work of relinking or of fostering belonging and participation, it matters more than for just the results. So leaning into this reality of love, right, of this cosmic conversation, that's its own gift. The alternative is the no and the nothing, right? But we are invited to being. And so I'll just read this poem. Again, it's Daffodils by Alicia Susskind-Ostraker. What explains poetry is that life is hard, but better than the alternatives, the no and the nothing. Look at this light and color, a splash of brilliant yellow. Punctuating an emerald text, white swans and mottled brown ducks floating quietly along, whole and alive, like an untorn language that lacks nothing, that excludes nothing, period. Don't you think it is our business to defend it, even the day our masters start a war, to defend the day we see the daffodils?
You're going to make me follow that. I feel sort of scattered in responding to this. To the question about lay leaders, I'll just share a story about something I got wrong at the beginning of the Faith and Elections Playbook development. When I was drafting a lot of it, someone on our advisory committee, Emma Petty Adams, who runs Mormon Women for Ethical Government, she rewrote a bunch of things to just make sure we were adding that this was not just for institutional leaders, that lay leaders can do these things individually. Lay leaders, our leaders, even if they're not clergy, even if they're not institutional leaders, anyone can be a leader in our system. And I thought that was a really beautiful reflection and piece of our process that I wanted to share. On the question of hope, I think the sound checks have gotten good enough on Zoom now that you can't hear my 2-year-old banging around upstairs. So some days, all I have left is like, I have to be hopeful. I have to get through this. And it's a reminder of like who we're doing the work for. But I also draw so much hope just from my faith. But one of the things that has been especially powerful this year, just hope as far as our democracy and elections, was we took the National Task Force on Election Crises, some of our members, to New Hampshire to watch the first ballots be cast since the 2020 election in a presidential election. And just seeing the process on the ground, going to a polling location, seeing the people working so hard, seeing these people take it so seriously, and and understanding that this isn't just happening in that one place, but now finding people as we continue this work who are stepping up in these ways. Half of my work is focused on election crises, and it can get really dark. So I'm really excited when I can turn to this work and talk to folks like you who are trying to find ways to improve our country, to improve our world, to serve God in ways that you are being called to do. And so being able to do this work is giving me hope, and being able to be here with all of you. It sounds kind of cheesy, but that's why I am spending time after hours with all of you, because you all are giving me hope. And it's just a pleasure to be with all of you. And I think we all need to, I love the question, because I think we all have to hold on to hope. That's one of the key things that authoritarians try to do, is to get the society to give up hope. And holding on to that hope is one of the most powerful things that we can do.
Amen. Amen to that, Chris. Amen to that poem, Kathleen. Thank you. Well, as we move to a close, first, I just want to ask everyone here to join me in thanking Kathleen and Chris for the presentations, for the conversation, for everything we've brought here tonight. I've been deeply moved and feel invited into the role that I can play in protecting democracy. And I hope that you all have as well. So you're welcome to share your celebrations and gratitude for Kathleen and Chris in the chat. I'm sure they'll see that. And then there's two things that I want to invite you all here to as we close. The first is to consider registering for the next webinar in this series, which is about disaster preparedness in your communities. So SBP will be taking the lead on this one, and it'll both be about the financial side of disaster recovery and how to become equipped with the knowledge to teach community members about how to be financially prepared for disaster recovery, and then also going over different actions that can be taken at the household level to safeguard homes against hurricanes, floods, and other climate disaster events. The final thing I want to share is an invitation that came from our friend and colleague, Christina Peterson, who works at the Lowlander Center, which supports communities that are dealing with the aftermath of climate disasters. So Christina and the Lowlander Center has been working with a community in Pointe-aux-Cheyennes, which was hit by Hurricane Ida 3 years ago, and is continuing to work to rebuild homes. She said they have a commitment from the Mennonite Disaster Recovery Network for volunteer labor to rebuild homes, but they're looking for a funding match to do so, and they're still in need of $850,000 to rebuild those homes. So I recognize that we are a people of action, and we are a people of faith, and as we just heard, hope. And so I just want to invite you all to consider contributing to the recovery of this place as an act of resilience and as an act of relationship. So I dropped the GoFundMe in the chat there. There's also, let's see if I can find the website. There's a website where you can learn more about rebuilding Pointe-aux-Cheyennes together if you want to learn more about the community and the work of the Lowlander Center. Okay. Well, thank you to everyone for being here tonight, for engaging in this conversation. And it's just the start. We have a lot of work to do before us between now and November, and the work continues afterwards. So thank you for taking the time out of your evening or your afternoon to be with us here. I want to send you forth with a benediction that I use to end each of these webinars. So please join me. May you go forth into the world as disciples of resilience, guiding your community and weathering the physical, social, and spiritual storms of the climate crisis. May it be so. Thanks, everyone. Blessings.
Thank you.